Okay, here's where we catch a real break from the College Board. In the past, I've had to cover a dizzying array of architecture. In fact, I recorded a test review podcast on architecture alone for this unit last year. With the new curriculum, we only need to cover 4 buildings, and of course, they're architects and schools. And of course, we missed some treats along the way as a result. The image on the left is a stairwell designed by Belgian Art Nouveau architect Victor Horta. It's paired with Gaudi's, he's a Spanish architect, famously weird apartment buildings, the Casa Mia. Gaudi's work isn't really easily categorized. He's a standalone artist, and that's his wild cathedral, too, pictured on the upper right. In fact, it was just finished. Both Horta and Gaudi are generally associated with the Art Nouveau and the earlier related arts and crafts schools. Art Nouveau and arts and crafts artists were dedicated to the synthesis of the fine and applied arts. They wanted buildings and their interiors to be works of art that harkened back to the great craftsmanship of the Middle Ages. Remember the Gothic revival, the Houses of Parliament? But like the architects of the Houses of Parliament, architects and designers of these schools did not reject modern materials, in this case iron and concrete. Yes, the Romans had concrete, but it only reemerged as a major architectural element in the late 19th century, in part because it works much better reinforced with steel. These structures were likewise designed to capture organic elements. Horta used twining plant designs, Gaudi used curves, a natural shape in nature, and he really tried to create a building that looked as if it had been planted and grown from the soil. Another term for this curving, unusual structure might be sculptural. Building is plastic art. Not all arts and crafts designers entirely rejected modernity. Some embraced clean, simple geometric lines that would reappear in the Bauhaus movement of the 20th century and also in Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School. The architects of the Eiffel Tower, by contrast, made no effort to recapture the past or to imitate nature. This is a monument to modernity, created for the 1889 World's Fair to showcase France's industrial leadership and the new building materials that allowed buildings to soar skyward. Early modern designers liked to expose metal to show a building's skeleton, and no example is more famous than this one. But the greater impact of new building technology, in particular the use of metal and the invention of the elevator, was that they made skyscrapers possible. This building isn't on the list, although another work by the same architect, who's considered the father of the skyscraper, is. We'll get there in a minute. The Prudential building is considered to be the first masterpiece of early skyscrapers. Rather than disguise the building's inevitable verticality, Sullivan chose to emphasize it with a narrow column of windows. But Sullivan's skyscrapers weren't just rectangular boxes stood on end. He added elegant ornamentation, especially of the cornice that tops the building, known as the terracotta. You can see some details of the cornice here. So here's Sullivan's own description of what he was trying to do, and this is going to be relevant to the next work, the required work that we're going to see. Quote, "The tall office building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, rising in sheer exultation from the bottom to the top as a unit without a single dissenting line." Sullivan felt that a building's interior function should direct its exterior form, and he coined the now famous phrase that the College Board loves, "Form follows function." Actually, I want to share the whole quote since it's quite poetic. "Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds, over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law." Finally, our first required work of architecture, another Louis Sullivan building. And now you'll see why I talked about the Art Nouveau movement, even though it's no longer in the test. Note the elaborate ironwork on the entry level and the curve that sweeps around the corner, giving an organic feel to what's otherwise a modern geometric structure. So let's hear from our first architecture presenter. Here's a photo of the building under construction. The steel frame is obvious. By the way, Sullivan cased the steel in terracotta piping, which increased its fire resistance. Indeed, Louis Sullivan's architecture is known as the Chicago School, not only because he mostly worked in Chicago, but also because his architectural innovations grew out of the experience of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. When Sullivan was a young architect, he was part of a team basically hired to rebuild Chicago. Huge swathes of downtown Chicago needed to be rebuilt. And architects like Sullivan were seeking out designs that met modern needs and provided better fire protection. So the building is remarkable for its steel frame structure, you just saw that, which allowed a dramatic increase in the window area created by bay-wide windows, and that in turn allowed for more daylight into the building interior. The large plate glass windows at the ground floor gave pedestrians a glimpse of the merchandise and lured them in from the street. Note the entrance on an oblique or corner angle. This was so it could be seen from both intersecting streets. The cylindrical corner tower emphasizes the building's verticality, which is an important theme of Sullivan and the Bauhaus and International style architects who followed him. I recommend you add verticality to juxtaposition and conjecture, okay? But notice that the building also includes Art Nouveau style iron decoration. Sullivan worked before the International style had gained full ascendancy, and he never shared their rejection of ornamentation, a reason why I frankly like him better. He also liked to use massive arches, which is a taste that would return with postmodern architecture, which embraced earlier classical styles as well as decoration. Stay tuned for our next and last unit. I've said that Sullivan believed form should follow function. Note how steel allowed for thin internal columns, and big open spaces. Here is a vintage photograph of the opened up second floor. Notice that the columns become decorative items. And the department store's elegant dining space. Louis Sullivan's most famous apprentice was Frank Lloyd Wright, who was also a Chicago architect and the most important proponent of what is known as the Prairie style or Prairie School. Wright was influenced not only by the low, wide vistas of the Prairie, but also, of course, by Sullivan and by low-slung Japanese architecture. So the interior plan of the Roby House, which is not a required work but an old favorite, was highly innovative. Victorian homes were broken into individual rooms, each assigned a very specific purpose. Wright adopted an open plan design centered around a hearth that encouraged multiple uses and lots of intermingling. And of course, that's now how we build houses. Like Gerrit Rietveld of the Style School, Frank Lloyd Wright also designed furniture to go with his homes. We'll come back to Frank Lloyd Wright. Our required work dates from almost 30 years later, and a lot's going to happen in the world of architecture in between. So back to Europe and back to visions of utopia. So this isn't a required work anymore, although it's another old College Board favorite. But the Schroeder House is probably the most famous work of de style architecture, built in Holland around the same period and employing a somewhat similar architectural ethic to Frank Lloyd Wright's. Rietveld was heavily influenced by fellow de style artist Piet Mondrian, so I've stuck in one of Mondrian's geometric paintings so you can see the resemblance. Interestingly enough, the two men never seem to have met in person, although they knew each other's works. Both Rietveld and Wright were very concerned about the livability of their homes, and again, they used open plans to encourage movement and interaction. Note that the buildings are not symmetric, and that unlike the Gaudi and Horta designs we saw at the beginning of the lecture, they employed geometric as opposed to organic lines. They're also fairly low-slung and do not use vaulted ceilings. So this famous building also used to show up on the test all the time. It's off the list, and I, for one, won't miss it. I think it's ugly. But I don't think you should miss this episode in architectural history, which is really important. So the Bauhaus School was founded in Weimar, Germany after World War I by Walter Gropius and continued by Mies van der Rohe, who is one of our required artists. It was the incubating ground for what came to be known as the International style. These were the form follows function guys, enamored of modern construction technology, simple, clean lines without architectural ornamentation, and a strong focus on excellence in craftsmanship that they do carry over from the Art Deco and Art Nouveau models. Another couple of big names associated with International style are Philip Johnson and Le Corbusier, we're getting there. Been making too many of these too quickly. Let's watch a clip from the Art of the Western World video, which will also give us a tour of our next required work, the Villa Savoy, and the work after that, Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance that the art historian who leads us through will not win any Academy Awards. Talk about stiff. But the visuals are really helpful. Pay attention to the furniture in the Villa Savoy as well, since it helps capture the design aesthetic of the time. So the Villa Savoy is an international-style house built by a famous international-style architect, Le Corbusier. On to our next presenter. So the Villa Savoy is probably Le Corbusier, I can't seem to say that this morning, best known building from the 1930s, and it had an enormous influence on the international style. It was designed to address Le Corbusier's 5 points, the basic tenets of his new architectural aesthetic. These may have shown up in the presentation. Sorry if I'm repeating what you heard, but here are the 5 points illustrated. First, ground-level supporting beams elevate the building from the earth, creating a better view and the sensation that the house is somehow floating on the landscape. It also allowed the garden to extend beneath the house. A functional roof serving as a garden and terrace that reclaims for nature the land occupied by the building. But in terms of functionality, I just note that even Le Corbusier encountered the curse of flat roofs. They don't drain easily, so they leak. An open floor plan relieved of load-bearing walls, so walls can be placed freely and only where aesthetically needed. Note the columns. We saw those in the Carson Peary Scott building as well. Frank Lloyd Wright also used this technique. Long horizontal windows providing illumination and ventilation. Again, this shows up in Prairie-style architecture as well. And finally, 5 unornamented facades that really serve only as a skin for the wall and windows. So, unlike his work on his earlier town villas, Le Corbusier was able to carefully design all 4 sides of the Villa Savoy to accommodate the views and the orientation of the sun. In other words, this was intended as a rational design for living. The phrase that he used, and this has shown up on the test before, is that architecture should produce, quote, machines for living. Like other architects of the Bauhaus international style, Le Corbusier was interested in exploring the potential of new materials, and this building is made of reinforced concrete. So, what does this building have in common with the Villa Savoy? Well, they too both use reinforced concrete, and they're both closely integrated with their surroundings, which just happen to be a lot more interesting when it comes to Fallingwater. So, let's hear from our next presenter. In the past, I'd warned students that the College Board seemed to always ask the same question about Frank Lloyd Wright, and the answer was always that he sought to establish an organic relationship between structure and site, and you see that illustrated here. Note, too, and I've mentioned this before, Wright's focus on the hearth as the center of the home and his open plan. This was true of both the Roby House and Fallingwater, as the picture shows. Also note he employs open plans and fairly low ceilings. Another Wright theme beloved of the College Board is the use of cantilevering. Those balconies extending out over the water are cantilevered. That is, they're attached to the building at just one end. Unfortunately, Wright's design was not as architecturally sound as it was architecturally interesting. It cost $155,000 to build this house in 1939, and it cost $11.5 million to restore it in 1994. The balconies were sagging, and they had to be lifted back in place with steel cables. You may not have time to watch it, but this link takes you to a very interesting 4-minute video that uses computer graphics to show how this house was constructed and designed to tie into its natural environment. So we have 2 international style buildings in our list of required works, the Villa Savoy and the Seagram building, which was constructed almost 30 years later. So let's hear from today's final presenter. So here's a question that appeared on a past AP exam. From the old curriculum, of course. I've already talked about technological innovations such as the I-beam steel frame and the steel reinforced concrete. Some other technological features, of these very high skyscrapers included floors that cantilevered from the interior frame. In other words, there would be tall columns going up the building and steel cables that would hold the floors up from the interior. And that way, the buildings did not need thick supporting outer walls. And it enabled the architect to use window or curtain walls, and these were actually often hung from the floor above. They opened the building to light and made them more functional as office space. The highly geometric forms show the influence of Mondrian and de Style, as well as Cubism. The less is more philosophy is reflected in the lack of ornamentation. It's worth noting that New York City's setback laws required architects to terrace their structures back from the curb to allow sunlight to penetrate to the street. They were worried that New York City was becoming a city of urban canyons. So the plaza in the front of the building was done by necessity, but note how well it integrates the building to the surroundings and how it creates a welcome open space in a crowded urban environment. In general, international style architects were very concerned about providing light, hence all the windows. And note too that while this building has the usual spare, mostly unornamented design typical of the international style, it is not completely undecorated. The architects have used bronze as an accent, and that's part of what I think keeps the building from being boring. This kind of glass and steel block would become the model for American cities. They sprouted up everywhere. Some, like this one, are more beautiful than others. Later, postmodern architects are going to rebel against that, but that won't happen until our next unit. So we're almost done. In my final lecture, we're going to head across the Atlantic to the Americas.